And then there was a time when I was working with Bjork. We went out somewhere and got really trashed, and then I woke up to the sound of her warming up.
What's that like?
That's pretty wild. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Anyway, it was pretty beautiful. But also like, wow, it's 10:30 in the morning and you're warming up. And then I started taking it seriously.
Tom York, my castaway. He's chosen some fantastic music, so do join us for his Desert Island Discs tomorrow morning at 9.
BBC News at 9 o'clock. A whistleblower in the American intelligence service has said the White House tried to hide records of a phone call in which President Trump asked Ukraine to investigate one of his possible opponents at the next election. Classified details of the allegation have been published for the first time. A senior intelligence official, Joseph Maguire, gave evidence to Congress today to answer questions about the delay in publishing the details of the claims. He denied he had been part of a cover-up.
The White House did not direct me to withhold the information. I was endeavoring to get the executive privilege concerns addressed so that it can then be forwarded. It was not stonewalling. I didn't receive direction from anybody. I was just trying to work through the process and the law the way it is written.
Boris Johnson has refused to apologise for language he used in a fiery Brexit debate in the Commons last night, but agreed tempers needed to come down in Parliament. The Prime Minister has been criticised for dismissing as humbug concerns that his words were being used in threats against opposition MPs. The United States has said it plans to send air defence missiles and about 200 troops to Saudi Arabia in response to attacks on oil installations there earlier this month. Iran has denied US claims that it was behind the attacks, which shut down half of Saudi Arabia's oil production. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has said falling childhood vaccination rates in England are unacceptable, and he could take action if they don't improve. New official figures show a continuing decline in the coverage of all routine childhood vaccinations for under 5s in England. Uptake of the first dose of MMR fell for the 5th year in a row. The French Parliament has observed a minute's silence for the former President Jacques Chirac, who's died aged 86. He served 2 terms in the Élysée Palace and took France into the single currency. President Macron said Mr. Chirac embodied an independent and proud France. BBC News.
Now on BBC Radio 4 with BBC Inside Science, here's Adam Rutherford.
Hello. Everyone who has been a parent will know the significance of weaning and introducing bottle feeding to a baby's diet. Well, this transition was also fundamentally important in the evolution of our species. We look at Neolithic baby bottles, once filled with cow's milk. And the story of how our knowledge of drugs, road safety, health, medicine, air conditioning, snow ploughing, and pretty much everything is skewed, often dangerously, away from women. Caroline Criado Perez wins the Royal Society Book Prize with her magnum opus, Invisible Women. But first, Greta Thunberg has been using her voice and her platform to alert politicians and the public to the climate crisis in the last few days. And one of the things she told the US Congress last week was, listen to scientists. So here we are. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released its latest report yesterday. This one is a special investigation into the oceans and the cryosphere, which is a term we use to describe all of the areas of the Earth where water is in its solid form, that is, ice. The report is a pretty miserable read. Ocean temperatures rising, the melting of the permafrost, and widespread shrinking of the cryosphere, particularly glacier and sea ice loss. Last week we talked about the Mosaic project heading for the North Pole, and that current assessments might have overestimated the thickness of Arctic sea ice. Phil Williamson from the University of East Anglia came back from an all-night session at the IPCC meeting in Monaco this week, and he explained why the interface between solid and liquid water is important.
The oceans cover nearly 70% of the Earth's surface, and we've got 10% covered with ice, and it's the connection between those that actually drive the climate. And we think in terms of temperature in the atmosphere, but really the climate system is controlled and driven and affected by what goes on in ocean and in ice, and those set the long-term trends.
So the cryosphere is in permanent flux with the waters of the Earth?
Yes, actually, that glaciers, there's always some melting from them, and there's also snow falling and reforming. It's when that gets out of balance. If there's more melting than there is snow falling on, then they lose their volume, and then the water that's in the ice then goes into the ocean, sea level rise and changes. Now, it wasn't that long ago, 10,000 years ago, that the oceans were a whole lot lower by nearly 100 metres, and our coastline was very, very different. It's just that any humans around then took advantage of the situation by walking across the channel. But now even sea level changes of just centimetres have very serious implications. So if now we're thinking again about, well, it could be sea level changes of metres, at least the projection under what we call the business as usual, but the worst case scenario, is it really the worst case? Could it be even more damaging than that? Is that there's likely to be, or possibly more than a metre of sea level rise by the end of the century, and that is pretty serious trouble.
Yes, indeed, that would be. I know it's a complex and long report, and I know you've been burning the midnight oil to get this out on time, but give us a sort of broad account of what the ice is like now.
There's ice in polar regions on land as land sheets. There's ice floating on the surface of the ocean, and then there's ice in mountain regions, in glaciers. There's snow of a seasonal kind that covers Canada and northern Russia and other parts during the winter time. And so some of those are coming and going on an annual cycle, some of those are longer periods. We've always known that sort of sometimes glaciers get bigger, sometimes they get smaller, but it's all the measurements from around the world that now have got the real conclusive evidence that we are losing not just millions of tons of ice going into the sea, it's thousands of millions of tons going into the ocean every year. And the big message is that rate of ice melt has accelerated, has increased, and that over the next 50 or 100 years, it seems now near inevitable that there will be further increase almost regardless of what we do. But if we try and control it, it will definitely slow it down and it won't be as bad. If we don't try and control it, then this situation could become irreversible.
There's a sort of domino effect as well, which is that as the permafrost melts and as the glaciers and sea ice melt, it actually stores carbon dioxide and that gets re-released into the atmosphere.
And from permafrost, some of it might be released as methane. Now, the report was actually a bit cautious about that, and it was, I'm not saying optimistic, but it did not state that methane release from permafrost was out of control. It was a little bit more cautious. Certainly it's been measured, but it wasn't the number one threat that was identified. It identifies the need for further work, and it identifies the amount of extra carbon dioxide or methane that could be released. But at the moment, it wasn't quite clear enough to give that sort of a high confidence rating.
And one of the other conclusions, I mean, none of this is particularly good news, but acidification of the oceans, or surface acidification, because the oceans act as a buffer for carbon dioxide, that is also getting worse.
Yes, and that's just very closely linked to the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. If they increase, some of that